She didn't speak when he touched her, not because she was afraid, not because she didn't want to, but because the room had rules, and silence was the first one. The chamber was still, even the fire had quieted. She lay beneath embroidered silk so fine it scratched her skin. The Emperor lay beside her, or rather next to her. His back was turned, his breath shallow. She watched the candlelight flicker against the golden dragons carved into the canopy above them. She remembered the way her hand used to fit between his shoulder blades, how he used to reach for her when the wind howled outside the palace. That was before the new girl, before the incident with the gift she hadn't chosen, before her words were deemed too clever, too sharp, too close to real thought. Now, even in the warmth of the Emperor's bed, she was cold. She kept her breathing steady, because if she stirred too loudly, he might leave sooner. And she had already counted the number of nights he had not returned. 13, 14, if he didn't stay till dawn. She had tried everything. New oils, new robes, poems rewritten in her own hand. None of it worked. There had been a time when her voice made him smile. Now it made him tired. She had made the mistake of wanting more. Not more gifts, more gaze, more time, more meaning. And in the Forbidden City, wanting more was the most dangerous crime. The Emperor shifted. She froze. But he was only adjusting the pillow. She whispered something, soft like a memory. But he didn't answer. Didn't even twitch. It was the last time she would share a bed with him, though she didn't know it then. When the door slid open the next morning, his robe was already gone from the stool. His perfume no longer hung in the air, and the maids entered without bowing. That was how she knew. She had become one of the others, not dismissed, not punished. Worse, ignored. The warm bed had been her last illusion of relevance, and now that warmth was gone, she rose that morning and folded the silk herself. The maids pretended not to notice, pretended it was all still the same, but the chill in the room had changed. It came from the walls now, from inside. Later, when they called her title, consort, they said it with the tone of a name that was no longer needed. They let her keep the chamber, but not the visits, not the whispers, not the heat. She would sleep under layers after that. 5, sometimes 6. But nothing was ever warm again, because what had gone cold wasn't her bed. It was the world. If stories like hers still make your hands shake, if you believe forgotten women deserve to be remembered, then subscribe and stay. Because we're just beginning to uncover what they buried in silk. She woke before dawn every day, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The candles were lit at the exact same time, each one trimmed by a maid who didn't speak, the same tea, the same temperature, the same way of bowing when presented. She woke before dawn every day, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The candles were lit at the exeat. Her first task, to sit and wait. Because in the Qing Harem, even waiting was ritual. She couldn't leave her quarters without permission. She couldn't raise her eyes without intention. She couldn't wear a robe with phoenixes unless her rank permitted it. And she definitely couldn't speak first, not to the eunuchs, not to the empress, not even to the emperor. Every gesture, every breath, every blink had precedent. There were manuals, scrolls, protocols carved into bone. It wasn't just tradition, it was control. The women of the harem were catalogued, like porcelain. The first consort, the noble lady, the talented lady. Each title more delicate than the last. A talented lady could not eat before a noble lady. A consort could not speak if an empress was present. Even the angle of a bow had to match your rank. Too deep, desperation. Too shallow, disrespect. The rules weren't just enforced by men, they were upheld by the women themselves. Because in this palace, power was a rationed fire, and every woman was cold. So they turned on each other. Whispers were weapons, silk was armour, perfume could be a curse. One woman was exiled for laughing too freely, another for asking about a sister she hadn't seen in months, a third for bringing the wrong flower to a spring ceremony, as if petals could carry treason. Even childbirth followed rules. A pregnant concubine wasn't allowed to cry out. Screams were considered vulgar. Pain, a lack of grace. And if she bled too much, she was hidden away. So the emperor wouldn't associate her with weakness. There were guards, but no protection, only surveillance. Maids listened through walls. Eunuchs reported whispers. Every gift you received was inspected, recorded, weighed in the scale of suspicion. The warmth of favour was unpredictable, but the chill of rules, that was constant, like snow that never melted, like breath that froze in the air. She once stepped into the wrong corridor at the wrong time of day. Her punishment? Not lashes, not exile. They removed her name from the roster. For weeks, she was not summoned, not seen. It was like dying while still breathing. That was how you learned. That obedience wasn't enough. You had to disappear correctly. Because in the Forbidden City, survival wasn't about being good, it was about being forgettable. Until someone needed to remember you. They told her it was an honour. When the letter arrived, sealed with the red lacquer of imperial command, her family wept. But not for the reason she hoped. They wept with pride. She was 13, maybe 14. No one quite agreed on the date, but that didn't matter anymore, because once a girl was chosen, her age became a formality. Like her name, like her past. She had been selected for the emperor's harem. That meant her body now belonged to history, and history didn't ask if she was ready. They bathed her in goat's milk, scraped her skin raw with crushed pearls, and oiled her hair until it glistened like lacquered wood. Not because she was dirty, but because she was being purified. Purity, they said, was beauty, and beauty was obedience. She stood naked in front of a dozen women, inspectors with cold hands and colder eyes. They recorded her height, her weight, the colour of her teeth, the symmetry of her ankles. One whispered that her shoulders were too narrow. Another said her nose was refined. Neither looked her in the eyes. When she tried to speak, they shushed her. Her voice wasn't required yet. Her silence was being evaluated. Then came the robes, the training, the transformation. She was no longer a daughter, no longer someone's sister. She became a number, a potential, one of dozens. They taught her to walk in silence, to kneel with grace, to serve tea without splashing even a single drop. Her handwriting was corrected until it no longer looked like her own. Her hair was pinned into shapes that made her scalp ache. They bleached her skin with powders that stung her eyes. And all the while, they whispered stories of the ones who rose and the ones who vanished. One girl vomited during her first audience. She was never seen again. Another dared to ask when she'd see her family. She was reassigned to the laundry halls. No one ever explained what reassigned meant. But the message was clear. Once you entered the Forbidden City, you didn't belong to yourself. You belonged to the silence. Every breath had meaning. Every glance was a risk. You could only speak when spoken to, and you were only spoken to when desired. Many would wait years to be summoned. Some would wait forever. And still, the family celebrated. Because outside the palace, poverty ruled. Inside the palace, even the forgotten were draped in silk. They didn't understand that silk could strangle, that silence could scream, that being chosen was just another word for being buried, while still alive. It began after the drums, 4 soft beats. The palace changed shape. Eunuchs whispered names into sleeves. Servants began lighting lanterns along the corridor to the emperor's chamber. Women sat upright in silence, their breath held like coins in a closed fist. Each night the emperor would choose one, or none. No one knew how. Sometimes a name was written. Sometimes a glance during the day was enough. Sometimes it was nothing, just silence and a door that never opened. For the women of the harem, the night was not measured in hours, it was measured in breath. One inhale, one exhale, the shuffle of footsteps, the shadow under the curtain, then nothing. She sat on the edge of the silk mat with her hair combed and perfumed. Always the same robe, always the same stillness. She was not allowed to move until the summons came. If it came, it hadn't come in months. She didn't count days anymore. She counted breaths. 50, 70, 100. Then the sandals passed her door, and she exhaled, quietly, slowly, so the girl next door wouldn't hear the grief in it, because grief made noise, and noise was dangerous. The chosen concubine was taken away barefoot so the emperor would not hear her approaching. She would be carried in a blanket if the weather was cold, not out of kindness, out of tradition. And if the emperor was pleased, she might be remembered, given pearls, elevated in rank. But if he turned away, she would return with her eyes downcast, knowing she would not be touched again for a long time, perhaps ever. Some women tried to stay warm by whispering poems, others rocked slightly back and forth, emotion learned from children in dark places. One girl once hummed a lullaby too loudly. She disappeared the next morning. No one asked. The rooms had no clocks. Only the ache in your spine told you how long you'd been sitting. Only your stomach, tightening with hunger, marked the passing of the night. The guards didn't speak. The maids didn't blink. The walls didn't echo. Because echo meant recognition. And in the harem, recognition was rare. When she finally slept, it was never lying down. Only with her head resting on her folded arms, so she could wake quickly. So she wouldn't miss the sound of her name. But it never came. Not for her. And yet she waited. Night after night. Perfumed. Painted. Perfect. Like a statue carved for a god who had forgotten he asked for her. There was no warning. No scandal. No rumour. Not even a sigh. One day she was summoned to the emperor's chambers 3 nights in a row. The next, nothing. Then silence. Then snow. She kept dressing, kept waiting. At first, the attendant still bowed, still asked what scent she preferred, still brought red lacquer boxes with new robes, just in case he remembered her. Then the glances shifted. Maids walked a little faster past her doorway. The eunuchs no longer announced her name in the registry. One day, a new girl was assigned to her wing and curtly referred to her as former favourite. That's when it became clear. The emperor would never touch her again. Not out of punishment, not even anger, just indifference. She hadn't spoken out of turn, hadn't made demands, hadn't disobeyed. She'd simply asked a question, a quiet one, softly after a meal. "Does your Majesty remember my village?" He had paused, not because he remembered, but because he realised she had. That was the mistake. To remember anything before him, to have a before at all. After that, his eyes moved past her like she was part of the wallpaper. A beautiful detail, no longer a desire. She was kept in the palace, of course. Exiled outside would have been mercy. Instead, she lived in a chamber of polished jade walls and quiet servants. Her meals still came, her robes were still delivered, but the summons never did. Her name remained in the roster, but only out of obligation. She was neither dismissed nor promoted. She became something else. A relic. A reminder of a moment the emperor didn't want to revisit. So she was preserved in stillness. She stopped asking questions, stopped smiling, stopped hoping. The other women stopped speaking to her too. Her presence made them nervous, as if disuse were contagious. Only the birds in the garden came freely. They landed near her fingers when she sat by the open lattice, listening for footsteps that never came. She once whispered to one of the maids, "Why does he not even send a gift?" The maid blinked. Because gifts are for those who matter. And she didn't matter anymore. Not enough to punish, not enough to banish, not enough to hold. That was the sharpest edge of all. She had not failed. She had not disobeyed. She had simply been forgotten by a man who was too powerful to remember and too indifferent to care. And so she lived, in silk, in silence, in a palace that echoed with warmth she would never feel again. The mirror lied. Every morning she stared into it, hoping to see the face that once made him stay. Instead, she saw the cracks, so she covered them. With dust, with powder, with poison. They called it beauty, a pale face, a spotless complexion, lips the colour of crushed plum petals, eyes outlined in soot until they seemed wider, more doll than woman. But the ingredients were never harmless. The face powder was made from lead, the rouge from mercury, the lip stain from crushed cinnabar. They whispered that it brought longevity. What it brought was stillness, trembling hands, hair that fell out in clumps, teeth that loosened, skin that cracked beneath the surface, even as it glowed on top. And still, they wore it. Because in the harem, aging wasn't a process. It was a death sentence. One wrinkle meant banishment, one blemish, a demotion. So they painted over their decay until it looked like perfection. Even the younger ones were told to begin early. Prevention, they said. No one mentioned the side effects, the blackened gums, the sudden fainting, the miscarriages. But everyone knew, because when a girl collapsed mid-ceremony, no one gasped. They simply stepped around her. The emperor never saw the damage. He saw the illusion, the shine, the delicate pink flush that took hours to fake and years to survive. One woman smeared crushed pearl dust into her scalp, trying to slow the hair loss. Another drank a cleansing tea that left her vomiting for days. They thought they were improving. They thought they were winning. They were dissolving, slowly, elegantly, painlessly, until the pain began. She once touched her cheek and felt the skin give beneath her finger like wet rice paper. Still, she smiled. Because if the emperor looked her way again, just once, it would all be worth it. But he didn't, and the smile stayed on anyway. It was painted there. She became a mask, a walking illusion, a woman whose face no longer belonged to her. Because in the Forbidden City, your beauty wasn't yours. It was his. And when he stopped looking, you kept painting. Because the only thing more terrifying than being seen was being seen as replaceable. So they wore their poison like armour, their decay like devotion. And died slowly in silence, with perfect faces. She carried the child for 9 months in silence. No songs, no stories, no names whispered in the dark. Because in the harem, children didn't belong to mothers, they belonged to the dynasty. Her son was born at dawn, under the gaze of midwives who didn't smile. He didn't cry. He blinked once. That was enough. They wrapped him in imperial silk before she could touch him, told her to rest, told her she would see him soon. But soon never came. The empress had claimed him, not with love, with rank. The empress, though barren, had the right to raise the boy, so he would not carry the scent of a concubine, so he would forget where he came from, so the dynasty could pretend he'd been born of proper blood. She asked once, only once. "May I visit?" The maid flinched, then bowed. "It is not allowed." So she waited. At the garden gate, near the southern corridor where the children were walked each morning, she saw him once, maybe twice, small, distant, surrounded by attendants who spoke in measured tones. He never looked her way. Why would he? She had never held him, never fed him, never kissed the spot on his head where the hair curled just slightly. She wasn't a mother, she was a vessel, a necessary step in someone else's lineage. Others whispered that she was lucky. Some women were forced to watch their children die, too sick, too small, or simply too inconvenient to keep alive. Her son lived, just not with her. He learned calligraphy from men she'd never met, spoke in a dialect she didn't use, wore robes dyed in colours forbidden to her rank. She dreamed of him sometimes, older, looking at her with eyes that asked questions he didn't know how to say. Where were you? Why didn't you come? Why did you let them take me? But she never answered, because in the dream, like in life, there was a curtain between them, and she was never allowed to draw it aside. Some said her son rose high, a scholar, a general, a prince maybe. She wouldn't know. He never came to her chamber, never wrote, never asked. Because to him she was just another name on the scroll, a decorative figure in the grand palace tapestry. And to the palace, that's all she was meant to be. A womb, a footnote, a shadow walking the garden paths with her hands folded and her grief sewn beneath her tongue. She no longer wept. That was for younger women, for those who still hoped, still waited. She had passed beyond that. Now she sat every morning beside the window where the sun hit the latticework in a perfect pattern, the same spot where, decades ago, she had once traced that pattern with trembling fingers, waiting to be called. She still wore silk, still had her own servants, still held a title, honoured lady of the inner court. But everyone knew what that meant. It meant forgotten. It meant preserved, not remembered. On paper, she outranked many. In reality, she outranked no one. Her meals arrived precisely on time. She never finished them. Her hair was still pinned each morning, though no one would see it. Her robes were still embroidered with birds in flight, though she no longer walked beyond the inner garden. And yet they bowed to her. When younger concubines passed, they lowered their eyes. Some bowed out of duty, some out of fear. Most because they had heard the stories, that once she had been beloved, that once the emperor had whispered her name in the hush of snow, that once she had been summoned 3 nights in a row. But no one asked what it cost her. No one asked what she remembered. They called her wise. They called her serene. They didn't know serenity was what happens after everything inside you is already broken. She didn't speak much anymore. There was no one to speak to. The women she had once whispered secrets with were gone, exiled, dead, vanished. She alone remained. Not because she won, but because she learned how to disappear while staying visible. The emperor had died years ago. She hadn't cried, not even in private. What was there to grieve? A man who had taken everything and remembered nothing? His portrait still hung in the reception hall. She passed it sometimes, and when she did not bow. She only looked at it. Once. Long enough to know that she no longer cared what the face behind the curtain thought of her. Now, when young women arrived at the palace, they were brought to her chamber, to observe, to learn. She said little, but they watched her hands, still graceful, still unmoving. They studied her eyes, and when they looked away, they never spoke of what they saw there, because in her gaze was a warning, a quiet one. That beauty could become chains, that silence could bury, that survival was not always something to be admired. Sometimes it was something to be endured. They say she died peacefully in her sleep, but that's not true. She died long before that. On a night when snow fell silently on a window pane, and a name that had once been hers was never spoken again.